Quad 66. In this video I'm just talking about, or at least bringing awareness, making you aware of this new site. So this is done by Carl Pablo, and it's carlpablo.com/thrust-stand, and it's a super useful site for us who are interested in 1S, because this whole site is dedicated to 1S stuff, at least for now, and it's in the stuff that we're interested in: 65mm props, 3-inch props. And it's also very well done because it allows combinations across either different motors or different props. And he's really tested a lot of the stuff that we're really interested in, and super useful information I really wish I had a while ago. But anyways, it's here now, so fantastic. And if you're interested in his setup and his protocol, definitely take a look through there and make sure that you feel comfortable that this is a valid way to be testing these motors. And then if you're happy with that, then go ahead and start popping up some comparisons and looking at them. One of the things that's important to understand about when you're looking at thrust data is a very important piece of the story, but it's definitely not the whole story. But it tells you what's going to be viable and what's not going to be viable, particularly on 1S when you have like restrictions in terms of, you can't just throw more voltage at it because you're at 1S, and battery weight and things like that are all going to be in play. But just as there's some other comparisons I want to dive into here and things I want to talk about, but I'm really just kind of trying to introduce this one in this post, and then other posts will go in and do some really interesting comparisons, especially as I get more flight time on different combinations. But so when we're looking at thrust data, what we're looking for on the x-axis is thrust, so this is the good stuff, this is what we want. And on the y-axis is amps, and that's the convention. And I think it's a little bit, to me, a confusing convention because, let's pop up another combination here. As an example, let's throw some Gemfan Flash 2540s. So, although this, usually when we're looking at graphs, we're used to thinking, okay, if this is higher, then this is better. But this is actually worse. And so what I did here is the combination you can see is I'm doing the Who Cares 65mm props, that's that blue line, and then the Gemfan Flash 2540s, same motors on that yellow line. And what you can see is that although these Gemfan Flash do produce a fair amount of thrust, it's actually less than the Who Cares. And it does it at, let's look at just profoundly different the amps are. So this is like 5.4 amps. And this is at 9 amps, so not quite double, but nearly double the amps to get that same level of thrust. So these are the kind of things that are very useful to look into. And so we can tell the difference between on 1S, okay, what's going to be a viable prop combination, motor prop, and which ones aren't. And so in this case, we can clearly see that these Gemfan Flash 2540s with the 1102 motor, 13,500 kV, it's just really not a viable option. What's really nice too is that he's really been exhaustive in the things he's looked at. So if we look at here on 1102s, you got Avan Blur, Avan Brush, 2035s, 2540s, 2040s. Like, there's a really ton of comparisons to be made here, and so you can go through those. And so what you can do is you can go ahead and say, like, okay, for the same motor, I just want to know the difference between props. And so, for example, I want to know the HQ T65s versus the HQ press-ons. And so now when you have these, you can see that the Who Cares, they're actually as good as we kind of always thought they were, that they are producing a lot of thrust at a low efficiency, or at a good efficiency. And the HQ props, they require, the 65mm press-ons underperform a little bit compared to the T65s in terms of total top end. The difference, it's not huge. There is some difference in the real world. This isn't make or break, but there's some difference there. And you can make some of these comparisons, and I find that super helpful when looking at different things. So you can pick the same motor, and you can look at different props. Then the other thing you can do is say, well, how about let's look at different motors on the same prop, and we can compare the difference between two different motors. Now this gets a little bit more complicated because when we pick a different motor, you also have to compare, what's it doing plus the weight of the motor. So for example, we're looking at now the 1103. These are the Hyperlight 12,600 kV. Same prop, some difference in prop, and up at the upper in the upper range of the power, they actually look pretty similar. Similar efficiency, similar thrust. But you do have to keep in mind that those HQs or the Hyperlights are actually a little bit heavier, and so even if this looks the same on paper, it's not going to be the same in the air because the weight is different. On the flip side, this is also not telling you the story of how well these motors manage these props. Now the HQ or these Who Cares props are really easy to manage, so I don't think there's going to be much advantage going to the 1103 here. But if we go to a heavier prop, let's do this comparison now using 1102s and T65s, which the 1102s struggle with a little bit. Let's pop these up here. Some nice dead time there as I'm scrolling through. T65s. Okay, so now I've got the same prop, this T65, and I've got the 1103s. And so you can see low down, those 1103s aren't as efficient as the 1102s, and you might say, okay, well, I declare, the 1102 the winner. Well, maybe, but when I actually fly these things, this motor has a harder time managing this prop than the HQ, and on this same prop, you can kind of take those things into context and say, well, how much is kind of the feeling of the flight, how well does it control the prop versus, just straight efficiency. And you also have to think about these in terms of the total all-up weight of the craft. If I had any suggestions for Carl to do, and he's done an amazing job getting this set up so far, the one thing I would potentially suggest is kind of normalizing this to a weight. So for example, you put in the dry weight of your quad minus the motors, and then so when you pick a different motor, you get like your effective weight. So you're normalizing the thrust to the weight of the quad, and that may help clarify some of these differences when we go to some really wild comparisons. So let's go ahead and do, just as an example, let's go back to the Who Cares props with the 1102, because that's one of my favorites on 1S. And let's go to the total opposite end of the spectrum and do the 1202s with the 3018 motors. And this is, to me, it's like a super interesting comparison, because although the 1102s with the Who Cares props, they give up sooner, clearly. The 3018 with the 1202.5 is going to generate more thrust. But it's remarkable how similar these curves are up until you get to the point where the 1102 just kind of gives up. But if you factor in how much heavier the 1202.5s are, then you're going to be clearly drawing more amps for the same amount of sort of hover or whatnot down in the lower range. And so that makes for some pretty interesting comparisons, and has some interesting implications too on what kind of battery you should fly. And clearly the bigger motor and bigger prop can handle a bigger battery, but you sort of need the bigger battery, because if you're down here, you're going to be sucking it down a little bit quicker due to the extra weight. So definitely more stuff to come from digging into this kind of stuff and using this to kind of give some objective data when we're looking at motors and props. But I wanted you to see this website, be aware of it, and it's really, really well done, and I like it. So I want to make sure that people know about it so that they can utilize it, as it's a great resource. All right, until next time, cheers.